After losing his wife in a tragic accident, a cold and distant billionaire locked himself inside his enormous mansion with his twin sons, who were left paralyzed from the waist down. He tried everything to bring normal life back, hiring nurses, caregivers, and housekeepers from the best agencies money could buy. But none of them lasted. Some quit after days, others ran away in tears, unable to stand the silence, the tension, or the strange sadness that filled every room. In only 2 weeks, 25 employees were gone. The man had given up on the idea that anyone could help his broken family, until one ordinary woman walked through the mansion's doors and did something no one else ever could. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. After the tragic death of his wife in a violent car accident, billionaire Richard Coleman withdrew completely from the outside world. He now lives inside his enormous mansion with his twin sons, Ethan and Oliver. Since the day of the accident, both boys have been paralyzed from the waist down. They no longer run or play like they used to. Wheelchairs are now part of their daily life and have become a permanent feature in every part of the house. Richard, deeply hurt and emotionally distant, tries to manage the situation by hiring professionals to care for the boys and maintain the house. He brings in nurses, therapists, and housekeepers, but none of them stay for long. The sadness inside the mansion is too heavy, and the pressure of being around such pain makes them leave. In just 2 weeks, 25 workers have come and gone. Richard struggles to connect with his children, who barely speak or smile anymore. He avoids eye contact and spends most of his time alone. The mansion is very large and used to be full of laughter and movement. Now it is quiet and cold. Each hallway feels empty, and every room holds memories of happier times. There are pictures on the walls of the family smiling during vacations or parties, but they seem like they belong to a different life. Ethan and Oliver spend most of their days in their wheelchairs, sitting near the windows, staring out without saying a word. They don't talk much to each other or to the staff. The silence is heavy, and even when someone walks through the halls, their footsteps feel too loud. Richard, although still trying to manage the house, has lost most of his energy. He keeps hiring people in the hope that someone will stay, but no one can handle the cold atmosphere for long. The workers complain that the house feels strange, uncomfortable. Some even say they feel like they're being watched, but Richard doesn't listen. He just keeps replacing them. Richard's daily routine has become mechanical. He wakes up early, checks the house, meets briefly with the staff, and then shuts himself in his office for hours. He rarely speaks to Ethan or Oliver, not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't know how to. Looking at them brings back the memory of the accident. It reminds him that he couldn't protect them, or his wife. The guilt eats away at him every day. Sometimes he walks past their rooms but doesn't go in. The boys, in turn, don't ask for him. They are also trapped in their own silence. The nurses try to engage with them, offering books, games, or television, but nothing seems to make a difference. They sit quietly, barely reacting. The therapists who come try different exercises and techniques, but even they give up quickly. The sadness in the house is not just emotional. It feels physical, like something heavy in the air. The workers who come to the mansion never stay long. They often arrive full of energy and hope that they can make a difference, but within days they begin to feel uneasy. Some describe nightmares or feeling watched, while others say that the atmosphere itself drains them. One housekeeper lasted only 2 days before she left without warning. A nurse quit in the middle of the night. Richard tries to keep everything under control, paying well and asking few questions, but the pattern keeps repeating. No one can handle the constant tension, the stillness, the pressure of caring for 2 children who don't speak or react. Some workers are frustrated by Richard's coldness. He doesn't explain much, doesn't interact much, and avoids talking about the past. Everyone senses that something is very wrong in that house, but no one can say exactly what it is. They just know that being there feels wrong. Ethan and Oliver, although still young, seem older than their years. The trauma of the accident and the life they now live have taken away the light in their eyes. They used to be full of energy, always running around, playing games and laughing. Now, they are quiet, withdrawn. They barely respond when spoken to, and they never smile. Their faces remain expressionless most of the time. They sit for hours without moving, sometimes looking at old photos or staring outside. It's not that they don't feel anything, they just don't show it anymore. They are trapped in their wheelchairs and in their silence. The therapists say it's a psychological response to the trauma, but nothing seems to reach them. They don't cry. They don't complain. They just exist. Richard watches this, unable to help. He doesn't know how to fix it, and every time he looks at them, he feels the pain of everything he has lost. The house used to be full of life. Parties, holidays, and family moments filled every corner with joy. Now it feels like a museum of memories. Everything is still in its place, but there is no life in it. Richard doesn't change the decorations or remove the family photos. It's as if he wants to hold on to the past, but can't bring himself to face it. He avoids looking into his son's eyes because he sees his wife in them. The resemblance is strong, and it brings back the pain. The silence in the mansion is not peaceful, it's heavy, uncomfortable. Every room is filled with a sense of something missing. Richard tries to keep order by hiring help, but they always leave. The pain in that house is too much for most people. The story of the Coleman family, once full of success and happiness, is now marked by loss, guilt, and silence. And that silence dominates every inch of the mansion. It was a rainy Monday morning when Grace Miller arrived at the mansion. Her clothes were simple, and her umbrella was half broken from the wind, but she didn't seem to mind. She stood at the large front gate, holding her small bag, waiting to be let in. When the door finally opened, she stepped inside, quietly looking around. The mansion was huge and silent, and the air inside felt heavy. Richard Coleman stood at the top of the stairs watching her. His expression was cold, as if he didn't expect much from her. He had seen many others come and go. 25 workers had already failed to stay. He was sure Grace would be number 26. Still, he said nothing and let the butler show her the cleaning supplies and her duties. Grace nodded politely, listened carefully, and got to work. She didn't ask questions. She simply accepted the job and started cleaning. She seemed calm, focused, and not at all afraid of the silence around her. As the day went on, Grace moved from room to room, cleaning carefully. She didn't rush, and she didn't just go through the motions. She wiped each surface as if it mattered, straightened objects that were slightly out of place, and made sure everything looked clean and calm. Even though no one spoke to her, she kept a soft expression on her face. When she passed by Ethan and Oliver, who were in the sitting room in their wheelchairs, she paused and gave them a warm smile. The boys didn't answer or look directly at her, but she didn't seem bothered. She greeted them again later, this time with a few gentle words, asking if they needed anything. Again, they stayed silent. Grace wasn't discouraged. She continued her work, but always found time to check in on them with kindness in her voice. Her presence didn't bring noise, but it felt different from the usual cold silence of the mansion. Throughout the day, Richard continued to observe Grace from a distance. He didn't speak to her much, only gave her basic instructions at the start. He expected her to leave by the end of the week, like all the others. To him, she was just another name that would disappear. But something about her calm attitude bothered him. She wasn't reacting like the others had. Most of the workers were either overwhelmed or frightened by the stillness of the house. Grace didn't seem disturbed. She worked quietly, spoke gently, and showed respect to everyone even when they ignored her. Richard didn't understand why she kept smiling or why she acted like the cold atmosphere didn't affect her. Still, he said nothing. He watched as she finished her tasks one by one, wiping the dusty stair rails, folding laundry neatly, and tidying rooms that hadn't been touched in weeks. She moved through the house like someone who wasn't afraid of anything. By the late afternoon, Grace had finished most of her work. Instead of leaving right away, she stopped by the twins' room. The boys were sitting near the window again, just like every day. They didn't speak. They didn't move much. Grace stood in the doorway for a few seconds, then slowly entered. She didn't try to start a big conversation. Instead, she placed a small piece of paper on the nightstand between their beds. It was a simple drawing made with colored pencils. The picture showed two stick-figure boys standing next to each other, smiling. Under the drawing, she had written, "You are strong." Grace didn't say anything about it. She just left the drawing there and turned to go. Ethan and Oliver looked at the paper silently. They didn't speak, but something about the simple message made them pause. For a brief moment, their expressions changed, just a little. A small smile appeared on their faces, quiet but real. That small smile was the first sign of emotion either boy had shown in months. They didn't talk about the drawing, and they didn't call for Grace, but they both looked at it again before going to bed. That night, something felt different in the room. The silence was still there, but it wasn't as heavy as usual. Even the way they lay in their beds felt more relaxed. Richard heard from one of the nurses that the boys had smiled earlier. He didn't believe it at first. When he checked the security cameras from the hallway and saw the moment on screen, he didn't know what to think. The drawing was still in their room, untouched. Richard stood outside the room for a long time, staring at the closed door. He couldn't explain why, but he didn't feel the usual need to dismiss the new employee. Something about Grace felt different. For the first time in weeks, he didn't plan a replacement. As the night settled in and the rain continued outside, Grace quietly left the mansion. She didn't wait for praise or feedback. She simply gathered her things and walked toward the exit. The house was still quiet, but something had changed. Richard didn't stop her or say anything as she left, but he didn't fire her either. That, by itself, was unusual. In the past, he had dismissed new staff after only a few hours. Grace had made it through the first day, and not only that, she had left a small mark. Ethan and Oliver hadn't spoken, but they had reacted. Richard noticed that, and it made him pause. He didn't fully trust Grace yet. He still believed she might leave soon like the others, but deep down, he hesitated. There was a feeling he couldn't ignore, a question he couldn't answer. Why had the boys smiled? That simple question was enough to make him stop, just for now, from letting her go. In the days that followed Grace's arrival, things began to slowly change inside the mansion. It wasn't something loud or fast. It started with small actions. Grace came in every morning with the same calm smile and a few new ideas. Instead of just cleaning in silence, she brought a small portable speaker with her. Soft music played while she worked. Not loud, not annoying, just enough to fill the empty air. When she passed by the twins, she would sometimes hum along with the music or tell a short, funny story from her own life. Ethan and Oliver didn't answer at first, but they started watching her more closely. One day, she brought a box of building blocks and set them on the floor in front of them. She sat down and began building a small tower. "Join me if you want," she said, then kept building. For the first time, the boys moved their hands slightly, showing signs of interest. Grace didn't stop there. Every day, she introduced something new. She brought small toys, puzzles, and games that could be used while sitting. She encouraged Ethan and Oliver to try moving their wheelchairs just a bit on their own. At first, they hesitated. Ethan was unsure and didn't want to fail, while Oliver tried immediately, even though his hands shook when he pushed the wheels. Grace didn't force them. She simply guided them with patience, celebrating every small success. When one of them knocked over a block tower or dropped a toy, she laughed gently and said, "That's part of the fun." She created small games like who could build the tallest tower or who could reach the toy car first. The boys started to respond more each day. Ethan, who hadn't spoken in so long, slowly began to whisper short words. Oliver laughed out loud once when he made a tower taller than Grace's. These were moments that hadn't happened in a long time. Richard noticed the changes. He didn't join in, but he started watching from a distance. Sometimes he stood near the doorway, hidden behind the edge of the wall, just listening. He heard Grace laughing. He heard his sons making soft sounds, small laughs, quiet words, even playful arguments about who won the game. Richard didn't know what to do with these feelings. For so long, he had lived in silence and guilt. Seeing his sons react again, hearing them try to talk or smile, brought a wave of emotion he didn't expect. Still, he didn't show it. When Grace passed him in the hallway, he nodded but said little. He didn't know how to thank her or even how to begin a conversation. But deep down, he felt something shift. The house didn't feel like a grave anymore. It was starting to feel like a home again. And all of this was happening because Grace had chosen to be kind, patient, and present. The rest of the house staff also began to notice the difference. At first, they were quiet about it. After so many failed hires and awkward departures, they didn't want to believe things were truly changing. But as the days passed, they saw that Grace was different. She wasn't scared of the silence or overwhelmed by the past. She didn't avoid the boys or act uncomfortable around Richard. Instead, she treated everyone with the same soft tone and steady attitude. Slowly, the rest of the team started to relax. The kitchen staff began preparing better meals, and the cleaners smiled more. People stayed in their roles instead of rushing to quit. The entire atmosphere of the mansion was lighter. Grace had gained not only the trust of the boys, but also the trust of the whole team. Her work went beyond cleaning. It brought warmth. Even in the smallest actions, like folding a blanket or arranging toys, her presence made people feel safe. One evening, something unexpected happened. For the first time since the accident, Richard sat down at the dinner table with his sons. It wasn't planned. He just walked into the dining room and saw that Grace had helped the boys to the table. There were 3 plates set. She didn't say anything. She just gave Richard a look that said, "You can sit if you want." And so he did. The dinner was quiet at first. No one said much. Ethan looked at his plate. Oliver fidgeted with his spoon. Richard didn't know what to say, but he stayed. Grace served the food, then stepped back to let them eat together. It was a small moment, but important. They didn't talk, but no one left. No one cried. They just sat together and shared a meal. It was the first time in a long time that they were together like a family. The silence wasn't empty this time. It felt full of possibility. As the night came to a close, something had clearly changed in the mansion. The sounds of laughter, quiet conversations, and even soft music echoed through the hallways. These were sounds that had been missing for too long. Grace had not fixed everything, but she had opened the door to healing. Ethan and Oliver now looked forward to their time with her. They pushed their wheelchairs with more confidence. Ethan started speaking a little more each day. Oliver became more curious and playful. The staff were more relaxed, and Richard, while still reserved, had stopped thinking about firing Grace. He still carried his pain, but he had stopped pushing everyone away. The mansion, once filled with silence and sadness, was no longer frozen in grief. At that dinner table, something unspoken was shared. Even though no one said the words, everyone felt it clearly. Something new was beginning. And for the first time since the accident, there was hope inside the walls of that house. Grace began to take part in every medical appointment with the boys. Richard allowed it without much discussion. She would help them get dressed, carefully assist them into the car, and stay by their side during the long sessions at the neurogenics clinic. This clinic had been hired by Richard not long after the accident. It was expensive, high-end, and claimed to be the best in treating neurological damage. The doctors wore clean white coats and spoke in technical language. During the visits, Ethan and Oliver were given strong medications. The clinic promised these would help with muscle response and recovery. Grace didn't question it at first. She listened quietly during the meetings, watched the nurses carefully measure doses, and took mental notes. But as the days passed, she began to notice something strange. The boys seemed weaker after every appointment. They would return home exhausted, their skin pale and eyes heavy. Sometimes they even had fevers. It didn't seem like progress to her. At first, Grace thought maybe the reactions were normal. She wasn't a doctor after all, and the clinic had a very professional appearance. But soon, patterns became too clear to ignore. Every time the boys took the medication, their energy dropped. They would sleep for hours afterward, and when they were awake, they weren't themselves. Ethan became quieter than usual, and Oliver had trouble moving his hands as much as before. Grace stayed close, watching carefully. She kept track of what days they went to the clinic and how they behaved afterward. She noticed how the symptoms came only after the treatments. She even asked the house staff if they had noticed anything. Most of them just shrugged or said they didn't know. Grace didn't want to believe something was wrong, but her concern kept growing. She remembered how active the boys had become since her arrival, how they were smiling and talking more, and now it all seemed to be fading again. During one of the appointments, Grace decided to speak up. After the doctor finished explaining the usual schedule and prescriptions, she asked politely if the tiredness and fevers were expected. The doctor didn't even look directly at her. He gave a short answer. It's all part of the recovery process. Then he continued writing notes and walked away. Grace stood there, surprised at how quickly he dismissed her question. She tried again at the next visit, asking if the dosage could be reviewed. This time, the doctor smiled briefly but said nothing helpful. Grace felt ignored. Back at the mansion, she waited for the right moment to speak to Richard. One evening, while the boys were resting, she gently mentioned what she had seen. She kept her voice calm and respectful, but Richard didn't want to hear it. His face turned cold. He simply said, "Science knows what it's doing," and walked away. He didn't ask questions or show any interest in her concerns. After that conversation with Richard, Grace said nothing more out loud, but inside, her concern turned into quiet determination. She began to write everything down. She kept a notebook hidden in her bedroom drawer and started recording each appointment, what medication was given, and how the boys reacted afterward. She made detailed notes about their body temperature, energy levels, appetite, and mood. She tracked their sleep patterns and even noted any skin reactions or muscle weakness. Grace was careful not to let anyone see what she was doing. She didn't trust the clinic, and now she wasn't sure she could fully trust Richard either. He seemed more focused on what the clinic promised than on how the boys were actually feeling. Grace didn't want to accuse anyone without proof, so she kept collecting facts. Each day, her doubt grew stronger. Something wasn't right. The medicine that was supposed to heal them seemed to be doing the opposite. She needed to understand why. Grace started paying even more attention during the clinic visits. She listened to every word the doctors said, even the ones they whispered to each other. She looked at the labels on the bottles and tried to remember the names of the drugs. At home, she searched quietly on her phone when she was alone. Some of the drug names didn't even show clear results online. That made her more suspicious. One afternoon, Oliver vomited not long after taking the pills. Ethan had a nosebleed later that same day. When Grace reported it to the nurse, she was told, "That's normal for high-dose treatments." But it didn't feel normal to her. The boys were getting worse, not better. Their smiles were fewer, their progress had stopped, and even the games they used to enjoy now felt like too much for them. Grace didn't want to panic, but every day gave her more reasons to worry. She couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Despite Richard's cold response, Grace didn't give up. She knew she had to stay close to the boys and protect them, even if she couldn't prove anything yet. The trust the twins had in her gave her strength. They still reached for her hand. They still waited for her stories and smiled when she entered the room. Grace used that bond to observe more closely without drawing attention. She also began quietly asking small questions to different staff members, but no one seemed to know anything specific about the medications. Most of them just followed orders from the clinic. So Grace kept writing in her notebook. She dated every note, described every symptom, and saved everything. She didn't know where it would lead, but she was sure of one thing. Something terrible was happening behind those shiny bottles and promises of healing. And no matter how much people wanted to believe in the science, Grace was starting to believe that the truth was much darker. Grace began to look deeper into the neurogenics clinic. She didn't do anything obvious. She knew she had to be careful. She started by using Richard's printer late at night, when everyone else was asleep. She typed the clinic's name into search engines and began to read quietly. At first, most of the results showed awards, praise, and articles about how advanced the clinic was. But after digging deeper, she found older reports. Some mentioned past lawsuits. Others said the clinic had once been fined for unauthorized tests. Grace felt her chest tighten as she read. There were cases of patients reacting badly to treatments, and some families had gone to court. She printed those documents a few pages at a time and kept them hidden under her bed. She also began to notice a strange pattern. On days when she accidentally skipped the boys' medications, they seemed better. They were more awake, more playful, and showed small signs of physical improvement. This made her even more suspicious. Grace didn't want to stop giving the medicine too often. She was afraid someone might notice, but when she delayed or skipped a dose, Ethan and Oliver showed small signs of progress. Oliver could move his fingers more steadily. Ethan had more energy and even laughed during one of their games. Grace started marking the days on a secret calendar, writing notes only she could understand. She used letters and symbols to track what happened after each skipped dose. The evidence was growing in her mind, but she still had no way to prove it. She knew that if she brought it up again without proof, Richard would dismiss her the same way he had before. And worse, the clinic might say she was interfering. So Grace kept her thoughts to herself and focused on observing more carefully. Every reaction, every small improvement, she recorded. The better the boys felt without the drugs, the more confident Grace became that the medicine was the real problem. One evening, something unexpected happened. Everyone was at the dinner table. Richard sat at the head as usual. The twins were seated on either side, with Grace helping them settle in. The atmosphere was calm. The staff served the meal and conversation was minimal. But during the meal, Ethan dropped his fork. When he leaned down slightly to try and reach it, his right leg moved. It wasn't much, but enough for his foot to lift off the ground for just a second. Grace saw it clearly and froze. She looked quickly at Richard, who had also seen it. His face changed. For the first time in a long time, he smiled with real emotion. He stood up, walked over to Ethan and praised him. "You did it, son," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Grace kept quiet. Her heart was racing. She knew Ethan hadn't taken his medicine that day. Richard thought it was the treatment working, but Grace was sure it was the exact opposite. Richard, moved by the moment, began to speak more openly about his hopes. He told Ethan and Oliver that he believed they were finally on the right path. He said maybe the hard days were behind them now. The twins didn't say much, but they looked happy to see their father smiling. Grace forced herself to smile too, though inside she felt tense. She didn't want to lie, but saying the truth now would only cause confusion. She needed time. She needed more proof. So she stayed quiet and helped clean up after dinner like usual. That night, she wrote everything down in her notebook: what Ethan had done, the time of the event, what had been eaten, and the fact that no medicine had been given. She even drew a small picture of the leg movement, marking the direction of the foot. Grace felt closer than ever to the truth, but she also realized something else. If someone found her notes, everything could fall apart. From that day on, Grace became more careful. She locked her notebook inside a box and hid the key. She also stopped printing documents at the mansion. Instead, she started copying key information by hand and throwing away the originals. She didn't talk about her suspicions to anyone. Her days were spent acting normal, playing with the twins, helping them during therapy, and staying quiet around Richard. But inside, she felt pressure building. She knew too much now. If the clinic found out she was investigating them, they might try to stop her. And if Richard found out before she had full proof, he could fire her or worse, accuse her of harming the treatment. Grace also noticed some changes in the clinic staff. One nurse seemed to watch her more closely than before. Grace didn't know if it was just in her head or something real, but either way it made her nervous. She began to feel fear, not just for herself, but for the boys. Despite the fear, Grace kept moving forward. She couldn't ignore what she knew. Every improvement in the twins on non-medication days gave her more reason to keep going. She stayed calm on the outside, never showing her concern, never giving away what she was doing. But inside, her thoughts were constant. What if she was right? What if these drugs were making things worse, not better? And what if the clinic knew? Every night, after the house went quiet, she read over her notes. The pattern was clear to her now. She didn't know the full reason, but something was definitely wrong with those shiny bottles and their big promises. The fear of being caught was stronger than ever. She started checking her room for signs of intrusion and avoided leaving her notebook unattended. But even with all the risk, Grace stayed focused. She wasn't ready to speak yet, but she was getting close. For now, she would keep collecting the truth and keep her silence. Richard was walking past the hallway when he noticed that Grace's door was slightly open. It wasn't like her to leave it that way. Curious and slightly annoyed, he stepped inside. He looked around the room and saw everything in place, except a small wooden box sitting under the bed, partly visible. He bent down and pulled it out. Inside, he found several papers. Some were printed documents, and others were handwritten notes. He saw names, dates, clinic references, and medical reactions. At first, he didn't understand. Then he realized Grace had been investigating neurogenics. His face turned red. He flipped through the pages and saw details about missed medication doses and the twins' reactions. His hands shook. He felt betrayed. Without waiting, he called for her. When Grace entered the room and saw what he was holding, her face changed. Before she could explain, Richard began yelling. He accused her of invading his privacy and spying. "You're just like the rest," he shouted. "Lying and pretending to care." Every time she said, "Please, let me explain," he raised his voice. He said she had no right to dig through clinic information or question his decisions. He believed she was using the boys to gain his trust for her own reasons. "You acted like you were different, but you're just here for yourself," he shouted. Grace stood still, trying not to cry. She said softly that she only wanted to help the boys, that something was wrong, and she needed answers. But Richard wasn't listening. He told her she had crossed the line and that her time in the house was over. Then he called the security guards. Grace looked around one last time, as if hoping someone would speak up. When the guards arrived, they didn't say a word. They simply walked her to the door. Ethan and Oliver saw everything and rushed after her, crying and shouting for their father to stop. The boys begged their father to listen. Ethan, with tears in his eyes, said, "Don't send her away." Oliver tried to follow Grace as she was being walked out, his hands reaching forward, shaking. Richard didn't respond. His face stayed cold, his jaw tight. Grace looked back at them with a pained expression, but she didn't fight it. She didn't want to make things worse. As the doors closed behind her, the sound of the twins crying echoed through the entrance hall. The staff stood at a distance, unsure what to say or do. No one dared to step in. After she was gone, the house went completely quiet. Richard walked to his office and shut the door. He didn't want to hear anything else. The house, which had recently started to feel alive again, returned to its old, silent state. That night, no one spoke. Dinner was untouched. The boys didn't leave their rooms. Richard stared at his office wall, unsure if he had done the right thing. The next morning, the staff prepared breakfast like usual, but something was off. Ethan and Oliver refused to eat. They didn't want to speak to anyone. When the nurse came in with their medication, both boys turned their heads away. Ethan pushed the cup aside. Oliver covered his mouth and shook his head. The nurse, confused, told Richard. He walked into their room and tried to talk to them, but they didn't respond. "You need your medicine," he said. They stared at him without emotion. He raised his voice, but still got no reply. The doctor from Neurogenics was called, but even he couldn't convince them. For hours, they stayed silent and refused everything. Richard didn't understand what was happening. He kept thinking about Grace's notes, the ones she had hidden. He told himself she was wrong, but something inside him didn't feel sure anymore. The boy's reaction was stronger than anything he'd seen before. They had never behaved this way, not even during the worst days. Richard spent most of that day in his office, away from everyone. He tried to read emails and sign papers, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to Grace. He thought about her laugh, how she played with the boys, how they smiled more when she was around. He remembered the quiet games in the living room and the night Ethan moved his leg at dinner. All of those moments had happened when she was there. Could she have been right? He looked again at one of the papers she had left behind, still in his drawer. It had a list of medication effects with a line under muscle weakening. Richard stared at that line for a long time. But no matter how much doubt filled his mind, his pride stayed firm. He told himself he had already made a decision and had to stand by it. He couldn't show weakness. Even if there were questions, she had broken his trust. That couldn't be forgiven. By the end of the day, the house felt completely different. Grace's laughter, her gentle voice, her soft music, everything was gone. The boys stayed in their rooms with the lights off. The staff walked more slowly and spoke less. Even the air felt heavy. Richard sat in his office with the door closed. He had not spoken to the boys again. He didn't eat dinner. He didn't respond to calls. He stared at his desk, lost in thought. The decision had been made. Grace was not coming back. She was banned from the property, and the guards had been told to deny her entry if she ever returned. Still, a part of Richard felt unsure. He wasn't used to doubt. He had always believed in structure, rules, and facts. But now the silence in the mansion was louder than ever. And for the first time since the accident, Richard wasn't certain he was doing the right thing. But even with that doubt, the rule stood firm. She was not to return. Even after being expelled from the mansion, Grace didn't give up. She couldn't forget the boys' faces when she was forced to leave. Their tears and the way they called out to her stayed in her mind day and night. She knew something was wrong with the treatment they were receiving, and she had to prove it. She decided to search for someone who had worked at the Neurogenics clinic in the past. After several days of calling different places, she found a name: Dr. Harold Beckett. He was a retired scientist who had once worked at Neurogenics, but left under suspicious circumstances. Grace contacted him and asked to meet. At first, he was hesitant, but after hearing what was happening with Ethan and Oliver, he agreed to talk. During their meeting, Grace showed him her notes and explained the situation. Dr. Beckett read the information carefully, then nodded slowly. He told her that her suspicions were correct. The medication was not helping the boys, it was hurting them. Dr. Beckett explained everything in simple terms. The drug used by neurogenics contained chemicals that did the opposite of healing. Instead of supporting the nervous system, it slowly blocked nerve activity. It caused weakness, drowsiness, and long-term paralysis if used regularly. He told Grace that some patients in the past had suffered serious damage, but the clinic had paid off families and buried the truth. Dr. Beckett left the clinic years ago because he refused to continue the experiments. He had kept copies of old reports and agreed to give Grace everything she needed. He handed her a folder with scientific data, test results, and proof of what the clinic had been hiding. Grace was shocked but relieved. She finally had something solid. She thanked Dr. Beckett and promised to take action. She took the documents home and stayed up all night reading them. With her hands shaking but her heart steady, she made a plan. She was going back to the mansion, whether allowed or not. Grace waited until she was sure Richard would be out of town. She called the mansion and learned that he had left for a business meeting and wouldn't be back for 2 days. This was her chance. With the folder of evidence in her bag, she took a taxi and returned to the mansion. When she arrived, the guards at the gate told her she wasn't allowed inside. Grace calmly explained that the children were in danger and needed urgent help. They didn't listen, so she showed them the documents. She raised her voice and told them they could be legally responsible if anything happened to the boys. The guards hesitated, unsure what to do. Eventually, one of them called the house. After a short conversation, they opened the gate. Grace walked quickly through the halls, heading straight to the twins' room. When she entered, she stopped in shock. Ethan and Oliver were lying in bed, both very pale. Their foreheads were hot, and they weren't speaking clearly. Grace sat beside the boys and gently touched their faces. They had high fevers and looked worse than ever. Their eyes were open, but they were tired and weak. She asked the staff why no one had called a doctor, but no one gave her a clear answer. Grace wasted no time. She picked up the phone and called an independent doctor she trusted, someone not connected to neurogenics. When he arrived, he examined the twins and immediately became concerned. He said their condition looked like poisoning or long-term drug exposure. Their vital signs were unstable and they needed hospital care right away. Grace showed him the documents from Dr. Beckett and the doctor nodded. He agreed that the boys had been given something dangerous. Meanwhile, the guards came again, saying she had to leave. This time, Grace stood her ground. She held up the documents and said, "If you stop me, you'll be part of this too." Her voice was strong, and for the first time, they backed down. With the guards no longer stopping her, Grace called for an ambulance. The boys needed to be moved quickly. While they waited, she held their hands tightly. Ethan's fingers moved slightly, and Oliver mumbled something she couldn't understand. Their faces were hot from the fever, and their bodies were weak, but they seemed comforted by her presence. Grace kept speaking to them softly, saying, "You're safe now. I'm here. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The doctor stayed close, checking their breathing and giving them fluids to keep them stable. The ambulance arrived a short time later, and the paramedics worked quickly. Grace didn't leave their side. She rode with them to the hospital, holding both of their hands. Inside the vehicle, as the siren wailed and the lights flashed, something unexpected happened. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. Then Oliver, in a tired voice, said one word, "Mom!" Grace looked at him, stunned. Then Ethan whispered the same, "Mommy." For the first time, they had called her that. Tears filled Grace's eyes, but she didn't cry. She wanted to stay strong for them. She looked at both boys and said, "I'm here. I won't leave you." At the hospital, the doctors took over. They began tests right away, checking for toxins and internal damage. Grace handed over the folder with all the information she had gathered. The medical team took it seriously. Soon, they confirmed that the boys had been exposed to harmful substances. They started treatment to remove the chemicals from their bodies and stabilize their condition. Grace stayed in the waiting room, praying that it wasn't too late. The hospital staff told her she had saved the boys just in time. If she had waited even one more day, the damage could have been permanent. Grace didn't care about rules anymore. She had done what was right. As she sat there in the hospital chair, exhausted but calm, she finally allowed herself to rest. She had protected them, and now the truth could come out. Richard returned from his trip early in the morning. As his car approached the front gate of the mansion, he noticed something unusual. Several police vehicles were parked outside. He got out of the car, confused, and was immediately met by two officers who showed him their badges. "Are you Richard Coleman?" one of them asked. Richard nodded slowly. "We need to speak with you," the officer said. The front door was already open, and more police were inside, talking to the staff. Grace was standing in the living room, holding a folder full of documents. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but her expression was firm. She handed the folder to the lead officer. "These are the original reports. They prove everything," she said. The police listened carefully and took her statements. Richard didn't understand what was happening. "What is all this?" he asked. The officer explained. Grace had uncovered serious medical fraud. The neurogenics doctor had been arrested that same morning. As the police continued their investigation, reporters began arriving outside the mansion. News cameras were already filming the scene, and helicopters flew above, capturing live footage. The story had reached the media. Richard turned on the television in the living room. Every major news channel was broadcasting the same headline: "Medical fraud at elite clinic exposed, children used in experimental scheme." The screen showed pictures of the neurogenics building, police officers carrying boxes of evidence, and a short video of the arrested doctor being led into a car in handcuffs. Richard sat down, stunned. He watched the broadcast in silence, trying to process everything. The documents Grace had collected were now being shown on TV, including her notes and the scientific reports. He couldn't believe it. The clinic he had trusted for months was lying the whole time. The medicine that promised healing was doing harm, and the woman he had kicked out was the one who uncovered it all. He felt completely lost. Without thinking much, Richard grabbed his coat and left for the hospital. He didn't call ahead or ask for the driver. He just wanted to see his sons. On the way there, his mind was filled with questions. Why hadn't he listened sooner? How could he have been so blind? At the hospital, he went straight to the front desk and asked for Ethan and Oliver's room. A nurse guided him down the hallway. When he entered the room, he stopped at the door. The boys were asleep in their beds, calm and peaceful. Grace sat between them in a chair, her head leaned slightly back, eyes closed from exhaustion. Even while resting, her hand held Ethan's gently. Richard stepped inside slowly. The sight made his chest tighten. The same woman he had accused, yelled at and expelled, was now sitting by his children's side. He walked closer, not knowing what to say. He stood beside her for a moment, then quietly said, "I'm sorry." She opened her eyes, looked at the boys, and didn't say anything to Richard. Instead, she focused on Ethan, whose hand was still in hers. She gently stroked his fingers and whispered something to him that Richard couldn't hear. He didn't insist. He stepped back and sat on a nearby chair. The room stayed quiet for several minutes. Richard watched both of his sons sleep, noticing for the first time how peaceful their faces looked. A doctor entered the room and began checking the monitors. Richard stood up quickly. "How are they?" he asked. The doctor nodded and said, "Better. Their bodies are reacting positively now that the drugs are out of their system." Richard looked confused. "Are you saying they might walk again?" The doctor looked at him and replied, "There's a real chance. Without the toxins blocking their nervous system, we may start to see more movement soon." Richard felt his knees weaken. He had no words. Over the next few hours, Richard remained in the hospital room. Nurses came in and out, checking on the twins and updating charts. Grace barely spoke to him, but she didn't ask him to leave. When Ethan woke up for a moment and blinked at her, she smiled and helped him drink some water. Oliver opened his eyes soon after and mumbled something softly. Grace moved gently, reassuring both boys that everything was okay. Richard watched this in silence. He could see how calm the boys felt around her. For months, he had believed that money, doctors, and high-end treatment were the only solution. But it was Grace, a woman with no wealth or title, who had done the impossible. She had cared when no one else had. She had asked questions, taken risks, and stood against him when no one else dared to. And now here she was, still fighting for them, even after everything he had done. Richard lowered his head, ashamed. The next morning, Ethan moved his toes. Later that day, Oliver lifted his left leg slightly off the bed. Doctors and nurses celebrated these tiny changes as huge steps forward. Grace remained calm, gently encouraging the boys and reminding them to take it slow. Richard stayed by the door, watching everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to take control. He simply observed, trying to understand how everything had changed so fast. The doctor explained again that with time and therapy, the boys might regain the ability to walk. "It won't be easy," he said, "but there's real hope now." Grace finally looked at Richard. Her eyes were tired, but there was no anger in them, just a deep seriousness. She didn't need to say anything else. The truth was already clear. Richard now saw the reality. The woman he had judged the most, the one he believed was wrong, was the only one who had truly fought for his children. And she had never stopped, not even when he turned her away. Without the continued use of the medications, Ethan and Oliver slowly began to show more progress. The effects of the drugs started to wear off, and the boys' bodies began responding again. At first it was small, tiny movements in their toes, slight reactions in their knees. But those movements gave everyone hope. The doctors confirmed that their muscles weren't permanently damaged. With the right therapy and time, improvement was possible. Grace stayed by their side during every session, encouraging them, holding their hands, and celebrating each step. Richard also made sure they received the best possible care. He was present now, watching closely, no longer distant. Physical therapy became part of their daily routine. Exercises were hard at first, but the boys pushed through. They were determined, and so was the team helping them. Each day they grew a little stronger. After weeks of effort, Ethan managed to lift both legs, and Oliver was able to support himself sitting up without help. It was the beginning of real recovery. As the boys improved, Richard made a major decision. He ended all contracts with the old medical teams and permanently cut ties with Neurogenics and its affiliates. He no longer wanted to be involved with any part of the system that had hurt his sons. He hired a new medical staff, choosing only professionals recommended by trusted sources and patient families. This time, he checked everything himself. No more blind trust, no more empty promises. He also invited Grace back to the mansion, not as a temporary employee, but as a permanent part of their lives. She returned, not as a maid or assistant, but as the official housekeeper and caregiver. Her room was moved closer to the boys. She was now included in all medical meetings, decisions, and school planning. Ethan and Oliver were overjoyed. They welcomed her with open arms and started calling her Mommy Grace without hesitation. It came naturally. To them, she was more than a helper. She was the one who saved them. With the family more united than ever, Richard began to reflect on everything that had happened. He realized how much time he had wasted trapped in grief and guilt. He thought of his late wife, how much she had loved their sons, and how disappointed she would have been with how things had turned out. To honor her memory, Richard created a charity fund in her name. The foundation focused on helping children who were victims of medical negligence, just like Ethan and Oliver had been. He gathered legal professionals, medical advisors, and trusted volunteers to make sure the fund made a real difference. The foundation offered support for families, access to honest medical care, and help with legal action when needed. Richard didn't want any other parent to go through what he had experienced. This project gave him a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about doing what was right. It was the first time in years that he felt proud of something again. Back at the mansion, life finally started to feel normal again. The house was no longer filled with silence. Instead, it echoed with laughter, conversation, and the sound of Ethan and Oliver playing or practicing their therapy exercises. Grace organized the daily routines and kept everything running smoothly. Meals were shared at the table again. Richard no longer sat alone. He talked to his sons, asked about their progress, and even joked with them. Sometimes he sat with Grace in the garden while the boys played nearby. They didn't talk much about the past. It wasn't needed. What mattered was how far they had come and how much had changed. The mansion, once dark and cold, was now warm and alive. Decorations were updated, music played again, and the staff smiled when they walked through the halls. The house that had once been a place of sadness had become a real home again. Everything felt different, but in the best way possible. The weight was finally lifting. Ethan and Oliver's recovery continued with steady progress. They still needed help, and their bodies were still healing, but now they had strength in their minds and hearts. Each time they stood for a few seconds longer, each time they managed a new movement, they cheered. The staff clapped, Grace hugged them, and Richard often got emotional, but held back tears. These moments mattered. They showed what hope and the right kind of love could do. Richard found himself smiling more. He stopped avoiding mirrors and photos. He began talking about his late wife openly, telling stories to the boys so they could remember her better. He even allowed her old piano to be tuned again. And now Ethan sometimes tried pressing the keys during therapy. Everything in the mansion reflected this change. What was once frozen in pain had now turned into growth. The boys were happy. Grace was part of the family. And Richard, once broken by guilt, was finally becoming whole again. In the end, Richard realized something important. The love he thought he had lost forever had simply taken a new form. It had returned through Grace's actions, through the strength of his sons, and through the truth finally being known. He had once believed that money could fix anything, that science always had the answer. But it was trust, honesty, and compassion that had truly saved his family. He stood in the doorway of the playroom one evening, watching as Ethan and Oliver played a board game with Grace. They were laughing, teasing each other like normal kids. Grace smiled warmly, helping them count the pieces and celebrating each win. Richard felt something inside settle. Peace. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing. The mansion, once filled with shadows, now had light again. He stepped into the room, sat beside them, and joined the game. No more walls, no more guilt, just family finally whole again. Months had passed since the darkest moments in the Coleman family's life. The house was no longer cold or silent. Therapy sessions continued every day, and the boys pushed themselves, one small step at a time. That morning, the atmosphere was calm. Grace was in the living room arranging the pillows on the couch when she heard a noise behind her. She turned around expecting to see the nurse or a staff member, but instead, Ethan and Oliver were coming in from the hallway, each one pushing his own wheelchair with both hands. Their arms moved steadily, and their faces were full of excitement. Grace dropped what she was holding and fell to her knees, shocked and overwhelmed. The boys looked straight at her with bright eyes. "We did it, Mommy," they said at the same time, both grinning. Grace covered her mouth, tears immediately filling her eyes. It was the moment she had dreamed of for so long, and now it was real. Richard was standing at the doorway just a few steps behind them. He had been watching everything in silence, unsure of whether to step in or simply observe. When he saw the boys entering the room, moving on their own, his chest tightened. He didn't speak right away, his eyes locked on the scene in front of him, his sons full of life, their eyes shining, and Grace kneeling in front of them, crying tears of joy. For a long time, Richard had imagined a day like this, but now that it was happening, it felt even more powerful than he expected. His throat closed up with emotion. Slowly, he walked forward. The boys turned and smiled at him. Richard placed a hand on each of their shoulders. Then, for the first time in front of everyone, he looked at Grace and hugged her. He didn't say much, just one sentence. "You didn't just save them, you saved me too." And Grace, still crying, nodded without a word. The staff, who were nearby, came into the room and stopped when they saw what was happening. A few nurses clapped quietly, and one of the maids covered her mouth in disbelief. Everyone knew what this meant. For months, the entire household had been watching the boys fight to regain control of their bodies. They had seen the bad days, the painful exercises, and the frustrating moments when progress seemed impossible. Now, seeing Ethan and Oliver moving their own chairs and smiling like any normal kids, it was clear to everyone that this was more than recovery. It was a miracle built from effort, love, and persistence. Grace stayed close to the boys, hugging them again and again. Richard, still standing beside her, felt lighter than he had in years. In that room, with his family around him and the staff sharing in the moment, he realized that their lives had truly changed. The house that once echoed with pain was now filled with pride, warmth, and hope. Later that day, the story of Ethan and Oliver's recovery reached the news again. With the court case against Neurogenics now closed, reporters had been following every update closely. The company was officially found guilty of medical fraud, negligence, and illegal experimentation. The judge's sentence was historic. Former patients and families from across the country spoke out. Grace's name was mentioned in almost every report, recognized as the person who had uncovered the truth. News outlets referred to the Coleman family as a symbol of justice and strength. Interviews were requested, but Richard declined most of them. He gave one short public statement where he praised Grace's actions and admitted that without her, the truth would never have come out. The image of Ethan and Oliver pushing their wheelchairs became a headline photo for articles all over the country. But inside the mansion, none of that mattered as much as what had happened that morning. That moment between the boys and Grace was the real victory. Richard spent time thinking about how far everything had come. There was a time when he believed money could fix anything. He had built companies, earned billions, and had access to the best professionals in the world, but nothing he bought ever brought peace to his home. It wasn't until Grace came into their lives that things started to change. She didn't bring expensive tools or big promises. She brought patience, honesty, and care. She listened when others dismissed the signs. She stayed when it was hard. And she risked everything to protect two boys who were not her own. Richard finally understood something he had never considered before. Real strength comes from small acts, from consistency, and from love. He couldn't undo the past, but he could honor it by making better choices from now on. That's why he decided to keep the foundation active and expand its mission. Helping others was now part of his life's purpose, not as a businessman, but as a father who had learned the truth. In the weeks that followed, life inside the mansion settled into a new rhythm. Therapy continued, but now with more joy. The boys practiced standing, taking steps with support, and building strength every day. Their laughter returned. Grace became more than just Mommy Grace. She was family. She ran the house, cared for the boys, and made sure that love filled every corner of their lives, Richard stopped holding back. He spent more time with Ethan and Oliver, helped with their exercises, and even joined them during some of the therapy games. He shared memories about their mother, talked about his mistakes, and listened to their thoughts. For the first time in years, he felt peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he knew he wasn't alone anymore. That day, when the boys entered the room smiling and saying, "We did it, Mommy," had changed everything. It was a moment of true redemption. The mansion, once a symbol of pain, had finally become a true home again. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.